Well, thank you so much for watching Morning Live. It's 18 minutes before 7. The South African Reserve Bank estimates that 97% of the 22,700 VBS Mutual Bank retail depositors will receive all of their money. Now, that's good news, and Reserve Bank Governor Lesetja Kganyago yesterday announced that Nedbank will from Friday provide retail customers with access to their cash from VBS. The mutual bank was put under curatorship after problems emanated from a failure of the board of directors and the executives at the bank to manage the business rapid growth and its funding and liquidity position. Now, all customers who have loans with VBS have been urged to continue paying their loans as they are still legally obliged to do so. And to discuss this matter further, we're joined now by Kuben Naidoo, who is South African Reserve Bank Deputy Governor and also CEO of the Prudential Authority. Welcome and thanks for speaking to us this morning.
Good morning.
So first and foremost, let's start with the good news. And this is that all depositors up to 100,000 Rand will be able to access their money, and they will be able to do that through Nedbank. But please explain to us exactly what that will entail.
Sure. Anybody who has a retail deposit, so it does not include municipalities or corporates, anybody who has a retail deposit with VBS, up to 100,000 Rand will be accessible. We think that that's about 97% of all depositors will be able to get all their money. We are not able to facilitate the payment of these monies through VBS. Nedbank has offered to assist in the payment of these deposits. So customers would need to go to a Nedbank branch, provide identity, some form of identification and proof of address, and Nedbank will open a bank account for them and give them a card. They've got an option. They can take the money out, they can leave the money in the bank, they can transfer it to another bank, they can use that card to transact or to shop. So from Friday morning, they would have full access to their entire deposit up to the value of 100,000.
So where's that money coming from?
Sure. The Minister of Finance gives the Reserve Bank a guarantee, and the Reserve Bank puts its money into the bank. We, in some ways, take the place of those depositors in what's called the creditor queue. We take the risk. Hopefully, as monies are recovered and as loans are repaid, we'll be able to minimize the actual losses. We'll be able to fully recoup what we've put in. We think that the 336 million that we've put in, we are quite confident that we'll be able to fully recoup that from loan repayments over time. But if not, there is a risk that taxpayers may have to foot the bill.
And that's the interesting part of this, because by Treasury issuing a guarantee, it effectively means that you and I, as the taxpayer in South Africa, are underwriting this. But why should we?
Sure.
Because, you know, this is a private entity and they got themselves into this mess all by themselves. So why should the ordinary taxpayer on the street have to underwrite this?
Sure. For a long time in South Africa, we've had what we call an implicit guarantee for small retail depositors. So, for example, when Sambo went under in 2001-2, government guaranteed up to 50,000 Rand of those deposits. And so when the bank was put into curatorship and wound down, government actually had to contribute, I forget the actual amount now, but it was about 2 to 3 billion Rand to fund, to make good for retail depositors. People who had above 50,000 Rand in Sambo lost money. But there is an implicit guarantee. From next year, we'll hopefully move towards a more explicit guarantee where the banks will pay an insurance premium to fund a deposit guarantee scheme that will protect depositors. And 100,000 Rand is the amount that will be covered by that scheme. So the Reserve Bank, the Treasury and the Reserve Bank use that 100,000 as a benchmark. So in some ways, there's an implicit social contract that says that if you put a deposit in any bank in South Africa, up to 100,000 will be covered by the government.
So with that explanation, you know, put to the side, what about going after the people who caused this consternation to begin with? Why aren't they held liable?
Sure. There are two parts of this. On Friday, the curator filed papers in court in what is a civil suit to put one of the major shareholders of VBS, Vele Investments, and 5 individuals to apply for their sequestration to be able to recover assets. We have instituted a forensic investigation with Advocate Terry Matau. We think that that will end around August, early September, and we will certainly hand over those files to the law enforcement authorities, and we certainly hope that there are prosecutions where there's fraud.
And then in March, I think it was, the curator came out and said, there was perhaps some hope to turn this fortune around. But yesterday, it sounded like there's actually no hope. So what's the situation as you understand it?
The 2017 financial statements were withdrawn because they were deemed to be not credible. These were audited financial statements, but in the view of the curator, those were not credible financial statements, so he's withdrawn those statements. There was significant fiction in those financial statements. The difference between what was in those financial statements and reality was quite wide.
Give us an example.
Sure. So, for example, the bank said that they had around 413 million rand in cash, and every month they submit returns to us of their cash position. It turned out that they only had about 4 million rand in cash. That's one example. The amount of equity in the bank, capital in the bank, was set at around 470 million. There was less than 120 million of capital equity in the bank. The bank had 22 what I call corporate loans, fuel finance loans, very large vehicle loans to companies, corporate loans. And the bank continuously reported that all of these loans are being paid. They're good loans. But what the curator found was that 13 of these 22 loans were not being repaid. So they were essentially not good loans.
Sounds like straight up fraudulent activity.
Yes.
So what's going to be done about that?
Sure. I think there's several things that's been done. First, we've got to recover the money, and we've got to take every step to recover the money. The forensic investigation that we've instituted is designed for 2 purposes: to aid us in the recovery of the money, and B, to see if there's fraud, is there a case for people to be prosecuted. We're taking that investigation very seriously, and at some point we will, when the investigation is complete, we will hand over those cases to the criminal justice system.
The other issue that is very disconcerting is that, of course, of municipalities making deposits, investing the sum of their monies that's meant, by the way, for service delivery to VBS. And that goes directly against the Public Finance Management Act, the Municipal Finance Management Act, the FIC Act. So you've raised a flag in that regard. The municipalities, did they adhere after you raised the alarm, or did they still continue to make those deposits?
They still continued. In fact, after the Treasury issued a circular advising municipalities that this was not permitted, the number of municipalities and the amount of money deposited both went up. From 13 municipalities that had about R1 billion deposited to 20 municipalities that had about 1.5 billion rand deposited. So after the instruction to municipalities was issued, municipalities continued to put deposits. What the preliminary investigation has found was that the bank paid about 20 million rand in what's called commissions to middlemen, some of them politicians, to facilitate municipalities putting to put deposits into VBS. We think that these commissions are simply bribes.
Mr. Naidoo, when did this start?
I don't know exactly when it started, but I think it started somewhere around 2015, late 2015, early 2016.
So there's clear unlawful activity taking place here,
Sure.
Because in spite of the fact that you pointed out to the municipalities that this goes against several acts, as it were, they continued to do what you were telling them not to do. Yes. So has anyone been held accountable in that regard?
Sure. We certainly hope that bank executives will be held accountable. The sequestration order filed in court on Friday is the first step. But I'm quite confident that there will be criminal prosecutions, there will be criminal sanctions. There's certainly at this stage the evidence that some executives or board members of the bank were implicated in what has gone wrong is quite clear. We certainly hope that at some point there will be prosecutions.
And you talk about politicians being embroiled in all of this, and we know VBS really came into the spotlight after that loan that was given to former President Jacob Zuma. Now, the question is, has that loan been serviced?
I don't know. It is not the policy of the curator or the Reserve Bank to report on an individual's account. We certainly respect customer confidentiality. So no matter who it is, we'll respect that confidentiality.
And with regard to the politicians who were instrumental in facilitating those alleged bribes, you know, who are they? Are they provincial? Are they, you know, people known at national level? Where do they locate themselves?
In the curator's affidavit, some of them are named.
Can you share that with us?
They're provincial politicians in the main.
In the main.
Yeah.
And has there been any indication as to why they proceeded to do this against your caution?
I think it was part of a narrative that said that it was part of a narrative on two dimensions. One is there was a lot of political pressure on municipalities to move their money out of what was called white banks towards black banks. Right? But secondly, I think that the executives of VBS deliberately solicited municipal loans so that they can continue to make loans to related parties, to friends, to their own companies. In some ways, it was almost like a Ponzi scheme. It was easy money. You get a municipality to deposit 150 million, and you give a brother-in-law's company a 40 million rand loan or a 50 million rand loan, which there was no intention of ever repaying.
And that is the scary part. But one has to ask as well, was there, you know, any further duty, any further responsibility on the Reserve Bank once you noticed all of this was going on?
Sure, that's a good question. I mean, we've been asked repeatedly, were you asleep at the wheel? Why didn't you pick this up? The governor has promised an inquiry, and that inquiry will include whether there are any regulatory failings. If we failed, we must be held accountable. If we missed something, we must be held accountable. If there are things that we can do better or improve our processes, then we certainly must. In general, we rely on the audited financial statements. We rely on signed statements every month by the auditor that says the following data is accurate. And for several years, this bank has received clean audits. It now appears, with what we know in hindsight, that those data returns to us on a monthly basis were entirely fictitious. They were fabricated. And that is very hard for a regulator to pick up. Also note that this is a very small bank. 2 billion rand in a banking system that's about 5 trillion rand in assets. 0.00016% of the banking system. It's a mutual bank, it's not a commercial bank. So the regulatory framework over mutual banks are slightly less intrusive than commercial banks. We've been putting huge pressure on the bank to try and upgrade their license to that of a commercial bank, which ironically would have allowed them to accept municipal deposits, but would also have allowed us to have a much greater degree of intrusion in terms of the regulatory framework and the way in which we supervise them. So we look forward to that inquiry, and if there's something that we've missed, if we need to be held accountable, then we're certainly ready for that.
And I can understand on the regulatory side with regard to the bank, but with regard to the municipalities, could you have done more?
When we first discovered that municipalities were placing deposits there, it was the Treasury that discovered it. And there was a legal dispute between VBS and the Treasury on whether municipalities are allowed to put deposits there. To give you the detail of that, the Municipal Finance Management Act says that a municipality cannot have its primary bank account at a mutual bank, only at a commercial bank. But it doesn't say that they can't make investments. And so VBS argued that these are investments, they're not deposits, and they don't have their primary bank account. The Treasury then went and got a legal opinion, and the legal opinion said, no, these are deposits, and they are not allowed. And it was only after obtaining that legal opinion did the Treasury issue their circular, their guidelines. After that, VBS threatened to take the Treasury to court, not once, but twice. So there were certainly discussions between VBS and the Treasury about the matter. The Treasury couldn't have just acted, they needed the proper legal framework to act.
Well, we are out of time, Mr. Naidoo, but just a final one with regard to the deposits by municipalities or the investments that they made into VBS. Are those monies lost?
They're not covered by the guarantee from the Minister of Finance. Depending on the successful recovery of loans from the bank, my guess is that they will get some of it back. I do not think that they will get the majority of it back. I don't think they'll get most of it back.
Mr. Kuben Naidoo, thanks so much for coming through. And that, of course, the Deputy Reserve Bank Governor and Mr. Kuben Naidoo giving us the lowdown, the breakdown into what actually is happening at VBS. Some good news, but in the main, it seems as though there's a convoluted web that was woven here, and some people will have to be held accountable. We're going to go to an ad break, and when we come back, it's time for the news with Leanne.